Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is, of course, Csaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Artale, an old school MapleStory server in 2024. Today we're going to be talking about all of the changes that have been made in Artale compared to some of the other old school MapleStory servers that you might have played. These changes are actually also relative to the true old school MapleStory experience from back in the day as well. So these are net new changes that have been made to Artale, oftentimes for quality of life reasons, or just to make the game more fun, or to change the balance of the game. And some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. But today's video, we're going to focus on the 6 biggest changes that have happened in Artale. Originally, I wanted to make a video that captured all of the changes, but as I continued listing more and more changes into the script, I was like, okay, there's a lot of them here. And I think it was better to do 6 of them that we could really spend a little bit of time digging into, and then maybe having a part 2 to this video that focuses on kind of some of the smaller changes and just having a list of the additional 20 changes that I've found. And that list keeps growing every single day that I log in, and I'm like, oh, that is, I guess, kind of different. But yeah, so today we'll get into the biggest changes, and let's just kick it off with the class balances and reworks. This is hands down the biggest change that has happened in Artale, and really was quite necessary. There is a lot of old school MapleStory jobs or classes that are more powerful or imbalanced relative to each other. Whenever you're a new player coming into an old school MapleStory server, if you are an experienced player, you typically know that there are the Night Lords of the world, and then there are, the other classes that don't have the sun shine on them all the time. Artale's tried to make this change a bit with a lot of buffs to the lower performing classes and just some small quality of life tweaks to some of the stronger classes that have remained strong in Artale. So don't worry, if you want to be a Night Lord that is still very powerful, you can still be that, but it gives you more opportunity to be some of the other classes. Now, I did want to go deep into the actual changes that were made here, but I tried doing that in the first take of this video, and it ended up being like a 30-minute section on its own. So I decided to release it as its own video a couple weeks ago that just highlight all of the different changes that have happened to each of the different classes and jobs. You can find that on the channel, or I'm sure I'll link it up in a card or whatever they're called. But you can also find the link to the source of these changes in the description below if you do want to read through it and see some of the stuff. Obviously, with any kind of balancing and class changes and skill changes, this is subject to change over time. I'm sure there will continue to be slight tweaks here and there. But as of now, these are kind of the major changes that have happened to a lot of the different classes. So with that said, let's get into some of the other changes that have happened to Artale. One that you're going to want to know when you go to make your first character is that there is only 1 character slot per account. This is a big difference from traditional old school MapleStory that had several character slots that you could use. And one of the main gameplay loops of MapleStory being, kind of that leveling 1 character, seeing this other job and their flashy skills, and having to deal with that for, several levels, and then eventually crumbling and making that job as your alt, and then doing that again and again and again. That was one of the core gameplay loops, and it's a little hard with just the 1 character slot. Now, there is a way to get around this. You can make multiple accounts. That is how people have these different alts that they play on. Obviously, it's not super convenient. You have to go through the process of making a separate account. You need to log into the different accounts. Transferring items is way more difficult than just using the kind of account shared storage devices, but it is something to be mindful of. So I wouldn't say, go in planning just to play 1 character necessarily, but go in with the idea that it's going to be harder to make an alt than you might be prepared for in other versions of MapleStory. The next one is probably the single biggest change apart from the class changes and stuff, and that is the auction house. There is an auction house in Artale. It is accessed in the free market. It breaks very frequently, but when it runs, it actually does run pretty good, and it makes the game way easier in terms of going to it for just small stuff, if that makes sense. Like, for instance, there are a lot of quests in MapleStory that require you to have some etc. items from monsters that you kill. in most versions of MapleStory, that means that you're going to kill those monsters and turn in those etc. items. You can obviously still do that in Artale, but one of the most enjoyable, quick ways to level that I found in Artale has been, oh, I need to collect, a bunch of wild boar tusks. Let me just go check the auction house and spend a couple thousand mesos, and there you go, quest complete. It's really made quick things like that very accessible and easy. And the flip side of that is if you are just a regular player grinding and you happen to be grinding a monster that not many people train at for experience, but is used for a specific quest, you can go and list your etc. items very easily on the auction house. Obviously, you could do all of this in the old school MapleStory free market where they used to have their little vendors that you'd set up. But that's just kind of been removed for this auction house. So there's a bit of back and forth here where it does remove some of the personality of old school MapleStory. I certainly am someone who used to enjoy walking through the free market and just scanning through the stores, seeing if there were any good offers and stuff like that. But the other part of this is back in the day, there were also the Owls of Nervia. These essentially let you search through the entire free market vendors as an auction house for one specific item. And if you had access to those, you'd pretty much just use that system, which would essentially reduce the free market to an auction house, but just a less functional one that required a lot of cash to use. So it's kind of better than that. You can obviously use it for scrolls, you can use it for weapons, you can use it to sell items. It really does work well. The downside again being that it is, there have been days where it's out of operation and the economy kind of comes to a grinding halt during those moments. So it is kind of a rough side that way, where it's clearly one of the more technical features that have been implemented to Artale. The other downside is that there are some limitations on the amount you can buy within a day. So if you are kind of that first example I gave, someone just buying a bunch of etc. items for quests, you can very easily blow through all of the buy limits you have in a day and have to wait for that to reset, which can feel a little bit not so great when you just essentially have to wait for your reset before you can use a feature of the game. So that is one of the downsides, but definitely something you should check out if you are a new player. You should familiarize yourself with the auction house. It's something that you'll use a fair bit. Tied to this is NX and Cash Shop. These work fairly different in Artale compared to other versions of Old School MapleStory, but more similar to probably other MapleStory Worlds games. So if you have any experience with other MapleStory Worlds games, you might already have some experience here. But essentially, there are a lot of items in the Cash Shop that can be listed in the auction house. Right away, this is kind of a bad thing because it means that you can pay money to get mesos. Like there is that transaction that happens, but let's be honest, that was going to happen no matter what, and it's probably better that it happens through official means versus some of the unofficial means that it could otherwise happen through, and I'm sure still does happen through. The positive to this, though, is as a completely free-to-play player, I'm able to go and purchase things like a pet. I saved up 5 million mesos, bought a pet, and I have a pet forever. It was that easy to do. It takes a while to get to 5 million mesos for a new player, but if you do your quests, if you get some good drops, you will eventually get that, and you can purchase a pet without spending any real world money. Similarly, I can use things like VIP teleport rocks, something that, if you weren't willing to pay money before, you wouldn't have access to. And because you're able to list these items in the auction house and trade them with players, you have the ability to do so on a free-to-play character, which is really nice. Now, there are other different things to be mindful of. There is kind of the whole wardrobe section in the MapleStory Worlds launcher. You're able to customize your character in there and then bring your style into the game. You need a style pass to bring the absolute look you have in MapleStory Worlds into the game. But even without the style pass, you can actually still change your hair and your face. And you can often do that for free if you go in there. There's quite a few free options you have. So if you simply want to look a bit different than the absolute standard character, but you don't want to spring for a pass yet for the style, you can still change up your character a bit, which is quite nice. And even if you do want to get the pass, it's a pretty affordable thing to pay some real world money to have this ability to just change your character and use all these cool cosmetics that go beyond just regular NX items. If you're someone coming again from another old school server and you've not seen the types of styles that you're kind of seeing in game, it's because of this system that people are able to create their own styles, kind of similar to MapleStory 2 in a lot of ways, and bring those into the game itself. So it is a little jarring sometimes when you're in game and you literally see Kirby walk past you, because you're like, what? But it is also nice because you see all of these very unique looks that just couldn't happen in traditional MapleStory. So really cool to see that. The next one, and this is probably the one that people talk about the most, but weirdly actually doesn't feel as impactful as you might think, and that is the limit of players within each of the channels. Initially, the game launched with just 50 players in each of the channels. This has actually been bumped up to 60 pretty recently, and could potentially get bumped up again as the game becomes more stable. But when you're comparing to other MMOs or your other experiences of Old School MapleStory, it sounds like a very small number of players that have 60. The thing with it, though, is if you are engaging in kind of the new content, the new zones, the new party quests, it can still feel like there's a lot of people playing, which is really good. There are also a lot of systems that allow you to talk beyond just those 50 players in your channel. So you do see actually still a fair bit of interaction with people in the game. And realistically, if you're, trying to grind in a pretty, popular grinding spot, you're still going to have the experience of flipping through channels and having them all full. So if you want to feel like the game is full, you're still kind of going to get that. But there are times where, if you're in kind of less populated areas, or if you're at the lower levels when there's maybe more of the game's population is at the mid game or higher levels, that you start to feel that there is less people. But when you're comparing it to some of the other servers that have been running for a really long time, it can actually feel like there's still a lot more people because there's more people at the beginning of the game, right? Just because it is a fresh launch and there are people still going through those stages. Whereas in a lot of other situations, you have people who've been at max level or in the high end of the game for a long time, and there isn't as many people at, KPQ and stuff like that. So it's kind of a double-edged thing where it does seem really bad, but it actually in play isn't as noticeable as you might think. And hopefully will only get better as they increase the cap on it. And this kind of ties into the last change here. And it's not necessarily a change, it's just something that comes with the fact that Artale is a fresh launch. The game's been out for almost 2 months now. Maybe it has been 2 months now. And we're still very much in the infancy stage of the world. There are only a handful of maps that have been released and added since launch. And because of that, a lot of the metas that you might be used to in specific training areas or specific items like maple weapons and stuff like that haven't been established or aren't in the game yet. And that's really fun because it allows you to play a different version of MapleStory than you might have access to somewhere else. When you don't have maple weapons, it really makes you appreciate a lot of the other weapons in the game. One of the core examples of this for me was the fact that they didn't have the Pink Adventure or Pink Gaia capes yet with attack power on them, which traditionally just, have kind of been the base standard of what the start of a good cape looks like was with attack power. But because those don't exist in the game yet, all of a sudden you have, the Urkus capes and the old Raggedy Cape having value with them because, there isn't this abundance of really powerful capes. So you start to see, this quest that gives you one of 3 different capes that can have, jump or speed on them being an extremely valuable item that otherwise wouldn't be the case. So it's really cool to see that. The other part is obviously the training zones. Because there aren't some of the more powerful training zones that come later in the game, you start to see people in different areas where they might not have spent time otherwise. There's certainly been a lot of people, at deep Eludi maps, which in more advanced versions of the game, you don't necessarily see that, but seeing these large parties working together in these large maps in deep Eludi is just, it's really exciting to see. And I think one of the most unique experiences you can have by joining such a fresh server. But yeah, so that's kind of the 6 biggest changes. I'm sure the comment section will have a lot of changes that they believe are the bigger changes that I should have included here. Do note there are a tremendous amount of additional changes beyond this. I just didn't categorize them as big. I am putting together a list of all of the changes that will kind of just really very quickly touch on, the 20 or so that I have listed and the continuous more that I add to the list in my next video. But if you have any changes you want me to add to that list, please keep them in the comments below and I will add them to the list if I don't already have them. But yeah, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and I hope to see you in the next one. Thanks.